Hello, and welcome to the SAM New Mexico webinar, Marijuana Education and Teen Substance Use. My name is Brendan Fairfield, and I serve as the Director of Development and External Programs for SAM. Please note, this webinar will be recorded and sent out to various organizations throughout the state of New Mexico. It'll also be on our webpage, www.samnewmexico.org, as well as on our Facebook page too. SAM New Mexico is dedicated to minimizing the public health harms of marijuana legalization in New Mexico. We believe that the health, safety, and economic harms of recreational marijuana legalization are far outweighing the perceived social benefits. We are holding the marijuana industry accountable and educating the public about its harms. We are medical doctors, employers, treatment providers, drug prevention professionals, business owners, employees, law enforcement officers, and parents. SAM New Mexico believes that our communities should not be victims of the commercialization and normalization of marijuana. Our presenter for tonight's webinar is Deborah Burnt. Ms. Burnt has been actively in prevention since early 2017, when she realized parents on the front line of youth drug use understood very little about today's marijuana, other substances, and almost nothing about adolescent brain development, and that the same was true for teens. She has written about drug research, youth prevention, and spoken to tens of thousands of parents and teens through work with Parent Movement 2.0, National Families in Action, a local peer-to-peer club and parent education group, Substance-Free Athletics, and Johnny's Ambassadors. Last year, she was invited by SAMHSA to participate on an expert panel creating a national guide for marijuana youth prevention, and to host a new podcast, Talk, They Hear You, What Parents Are Saying. We are pleased to welcome Debbie Burnt. Debbie, take it away. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Let me get this shared. Make sure you can see it. Oh, hold on a second.
Yeah, we got it. Looks great.
Okay, we got one tricky. There we go. Okay, still look good?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. So hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. And as Brendan said, we're going to be doing a little marijuana education and 21st century perspective on teen substance use. Why are we doing this? Hold on. Get my thing. It's not working here. Okay, we're doing this because of something called normalization. Well, and the fact that the state of New Mexico has decided to legalize marijuana, and that legalization process drives normalization in our communities. There is an immediate psychological shift when a state legalizes, almost literally overnight when it is approved. The thinking of, oh, this drug is bad for me, it's illegal, flips to, it must be okay for me, it's legal. And that happens for everyone. Every adult you know, every child you know, no one is immune to that shift. The problem with that is most people don't understand that in that shift, some environmental protective factors go away immediately as well. The fact that access goes up to the drug goes up, makes it more available, makes it more visible, adds to the normalization, and adds to this belief that it's okay. The perception of harm goes down as well, and the calculus of marijuana uses changes completely. It goes from an individual small group decision to use, do we know anybody who's got any, do we have money, where can we get it, to a mass marketed and a social media encouraged activity that is laden with feature and benefit languages and imagery and all this kind of stuff that you see in product promotion, in any kind of product promotion. So what do we do as parents? Well, the best defense for parents is always education. Our kids are increasingly more marijuana savvy, or they believe they are. And as parents, we need to get some understanding about this drug so that we can actually be in conversation with our kids about it. So we can push back when we feel like we're hearing things that we don't want to hear, that we don't agree with. And so that we can set some kind of tone in our family that we want to have there. If you are quiet about marijuana, or if you are neutral about marijuana when you live in a legal state, your kids think you are okay with it. It's just a new fact of life. So We're going to run through three things. We're going to look at kind of the mechanics of marijuana. We're going to look at forms and potencies, and then we're going to talk about substance use, adolescent substance use, and what we know about it now. Parents really have a lot to learn. So marijuana, you hear it called all kinds of things. It is a plant, comes in many forms. Cannabis is its Latin name. Cannabinoid, you may have heard. It is hallucinogenic. It can have other properties and experiences or characteristics, but it is a hallucinogenic drug. THC is what we commonly talk about, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That's the cannabinoid in marijuana that makes you high. CBD we hear about as well, and we also hear about hemp. So to start learning about marijuana, to be able to have a conversation with someone about it, you have to start talking and thinking about the brain a little bit. And this first statement here is one of my favorites. Favorite neurologist says it. The brain you go to bed with tonight is not the same brain you woke up with this morning. This is true for every human. It is especially true for humans that are 0 to 25 years old. This is talking about elasticity. Your brain is a learning organ. It's highly adaptive. It grows and matures through a feedback system. So you do anything in a day and you get all kinds of feedback through your 5 senses, goes up into your brain, circles around, gets turned into knowledge and stored into memory. That is happening all the time, every moment you are alive, awake or asleep. Your brain essentially ends up being who you are and the repository of what you understand and really who you are in the world. So there's a specific system in that brain that you need to know if you want to, again, talk about marijuana. It's called the endocannabinoid receptor system. And we actually have naturally occurring cannabinoids in our brain. One primary one is called anandamide that runs on that system and makes it function properly. That system, the receptors you may have heard called CB1 and or CB2 receptors. Anandamide is needed to make all those function properly. So THC, which is a cannabinoid, gets in the brain and runs on that system. It kicks anandamide off, takes over, and runs it. When I talk to kids and or parents, there will invariably be someone who says, well, if THC is doing something in my brain that my brain already does naturally, doesn't that make it, better for me? And the short answer to that is no. The longer answer is it probably makes it worse, and that's because of homeostasis. You have cannabinoids running through the top of, these are brain circuits, through the top of a brain circuit, crossing the synaptic gap and getting picked up on the receiving side of that circuit. When a brain is inundated with too many cannabinoids, it will have a reaction to try and balance it. And one of those reactions is to start turning off the receptor side of the brain circuit to try to limit the impact of the THC. That is a real physiological event. This is an MRI of a 16-year-old that uses a lot of pot. This is a 16-year-old that does not. These holes in this brain are not really holes, but they're where neural activity and blood flow have slowed way down in the brain. So what is this system, or what do we know about it? And if we look at the brain, there are 6 major regions where we see super high concentrations of CB1 and CB2 receptors. And that indicates that those regions really need the right amount of cannabinoids to function properly. So just so you know what they are, the hippocampus, which is all about memory and learning. The frontal lobe is about, it's where ideas are sparked and they're held in working memory. Then the basal ganglia is all about body organization. Kid may have a thought, go catch that ball, sparks in the frontal lobe, held in memory, the basal ganglia gets organized. And then the cerebellum kicks in and is all about fine motor to finish a movement. The amygdala switches from movement into kind of emotional processing, and then the nucleus accumbens. That is part of our pleasure reward pathway. Dopamine fires off in there. Anything that affects your nucleus accumbens has the potential to addict. That's why we don't get addicted to things like antibiotics and due to other compounds. So if you just summarize the effects of marijuana, again, they're in that movement space, the memory space, and the emotional growth space. And everything in those spaces can get highly compromised. I like to point out that very bottom point about violence can increase and anger management can become more difficult. That is typically counterintuitive. Most people think if you're smoking pot, you're really chill, you're really relaxed. I would direct you to a book called Tell Your Children, The Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. Um, there is a real violence component to this drug. And obviously it's not for everyone, or it doesn't happen to everyone, but it can happen to all kinds of users, a brand new user to a long-term user. And Alex Berenson does a great job describing that and laying that out so that's easy to understand. So back to the teenage brain, why might it be susceptible, and why might this drug be problematic? And it's because there's so much exciting stuff happening with the teenage brain. From 13 to 18, they're doing all kinds of pruning and something called myelination, where they get rid of all kinds of little circuits that they don't need anymore. And they start building these really efficient neural channels that process information. And this superhighway analogy is actually really appropriate here. The other thing that we'd like to tell parents, because parenting, it can be so difficult at times, is real quickly talk about the three major components of the brain, because it affects how we parent or informs how we parent, and it tells us a lot about drugs and alcohol. So at your brain stem, the very central part of your brain, it's called the reptilian brain. It's where all those involuntary functions happen, like breathing and circulation and that kind of thing. It's where your deeply primal instincts are. Am I safe? Do I have enough to eat? Is there anything that's going to hurt me? Then wrapped around that is called the limbic system. Hold on a second. Anyway, the limbic system, also the mammalian brain. And this is a much more emotional part of the brain. And do I feel cared for? And do I trust? And where do I belong? How do I fit in? Or all the things circling around in that part of the brain. And then there's the prefrontal cortex that's wrapped around that. And that's all executive function, discernment, right and wrong, insight, the understanding of cause and effect, impulse control, those kinds of things. So what's interesting about this, especially as a parent, is from 12 to 17, the limbic system is on fire. If you did an MRI, that part of the brain is just going off. It is lit up. And kids are processing all that. Where do I fit? And how do I belong? And their sense of emotion. And their prefrontal cortex, they have some executive function, but not near the amount they're going to have. And it's not informing or interacting with all that emotional processing very well. When they get to 18, it switches, and the limbic system calms down and the prefrontal cortex goes off, and all of that executive function starts to grow and build and evolve. Most agree that the brain is fully developed at 26. There's some, maybe a little later for some, but what this tells us, besides the fact that we have to keep parenting, that's why we have to keep parenting as our kids get to be teenagers, is because we have to act as their prefrontal cortex or help them understand how to navigate without a fully functioning one. And we know that drugs and alcohol are very complicated neurologically, and you need that full brain set to really thrive before and to deal with drugs and alcohol. We go on and talk about, well, let me back up. We know also that the teenage brain is really different from an adult brain. And it's probably because of all of this growth and development. It can get injured more easily, and it doesn't repair or heal as quickly. Then we go on to talk about different conditions back to marijuana that can affect that brain. And you'll always hear that, especially people who are very much in favor of the drug, that we need to reschedule it so we can do research on it. Well, if you do a search in PubMed, one of the major research engines for marijuana, you'll get over 36,000 studies, and it's growing every month, literally. We know a tremendous amount about this drug, and especially in the Department of Harms. Kids in particular seem to have a lot of researched and documented harms that come from the drug. First of all, in the mental category, it can cause psychosis. It is considered a causal factor for schizophrenia. That's for kind of across all ages. And we've seen IQ loss, significant IQ loss in many studies. Emotionally, we see an increase in anxiety and depression. We see amotivational syndrome, which is truly a real syndrome that is found in the DSM-5. It is an affectation of the amygdala where the motivation of the child just really decreases. And we see an increase in suicide attempts up to 7 times versus non-using peers, which is a very frightening part, which is very frightening research. See physical implications as well. And this idea that you can consume a toxin with no implications has always been misguided, but there are all kinds of physical and brain oriented limitations or harms. So we want to talk for a minute about if marijuana is addictive or not. Most people understand now that it is, but the way and the reason we know this is manyfold. One, we know that NIDA looks at users and has determined that about 30% of marijuana users have a use disorder of some kind. We know it's addictive because it meets all the criteria for biological addiction. It activates that nucleus accumbens, which we already talked about. It is lipophilic, which is such an interesting part of this drug that literally no one ever talks about. Lipophilic means fat soluble. So if you compare it to alcohol, for example, which is water soluble, when you drink something, it gets into your system, makes you drunk, then it gets flushed out of your system over the next 24 or 30 hours, usually at the most, through urination, breathing, sweating. Marijuana being fat soluble, it gets into your system, goes to your brain, makes you high. And while you're still high, your body starts pulling that toxin out of the bloodstream and depositing it into your fatty tissue around your body. Once you're done being high and you're more at stasis, your body will start leaching that THC back into your bloodstream to be carried out through the excretory systems. So that is when it's doing that, a very low level amount of impairment that most people can cognitively rise above. A person wouldn't necessarily seem or feel high at that time. But if a person took a drug test, that shows up on the drug test. If they took a really sophisticated movement or memory test, that impairment can show up on those as well. So it's one of the reasons people stay in relationship with this drug for so long. It's in their systems for a long time. And it's why you will hear some people say, I tested positive for marijuana weeks after I used it. It's very potent, which we'll talk about later. All of these things are components of how we know it's addictive and why it addicts. The next topic we like to cover is can I overdose or die from marijuana? And this is a yes, no answer. Marijuana does not shut down the brain stem like most drugs that kill via overdose. So, the brainstem wasn't one of those 6 regions of the endocannabinoid system. It certainly has some CB1 and CB2 receptors in it, but not at the levels it would need to actually have a person die from an overdose. That said, you can absolutely overdose on marijuana. It's usually in the form of, and looks like psychosis or a psychotic break. That hypermesis syndrome is also a form of overdose. And people end up in the hospital because of marijuana all the time. In psychotic states, it's also important to know that suicide, homicide, accidental death are they're not extremely common, but they happen, and more often than we want them to. One of the other disturbing things about a psychotic break is that only about 50% of people return to their pre-break normal. And that non-normal can be anything from just not quite themselves to unrelenting and permanent schizophrenia. So it's a huge range of what that could be. But that's really a concerning idea. The last way people die on marijuana is through traffic fatalities. And it happens a lot. In fact, every state that is legalized has seen 50% to increases to doubling of traffic fatalities shortly after those laws have gone into effect. We also know that drinking alcohol and marijuana makes you 8 times more impaired than consuming them alone. So in conclusion about the teenage brain, kids are supposed to be doing all kinds of great things, figuring out what fires off dopamine in their brains, what's important, what's motivating to them, what's unmotivating them. The amount of brain development that is happening is it's so much. And marijuana spoofs the brain. It takes over memory, floods the brain with too many cannabinoids, it fires off dopamine at the time, and really compromises real self-discovery and puts a lot of misinformed or non-real feedback into their developing brain and can cause all kinds of problems. Okay, so forms and potencies, real quick. There are 4 forms today: plant form, liquid concentrates, solid concentrates, edibles, and then kind of a catch-all other. We're going to look at plant form comparing today to the 1990s. Lots of times you'll hear people say, well, it's more potent today than Woodstock weed. I don't know a parent today that has a middle schooler or a high schooler that was either born or conscious in 1969. So don't care about Woodstock weed, but I know most of us were in high school in the 1980s and the 1990s. So if you smoked a joint as recently as the 1990s, you consumed about 3% THC. Today, there is no plant form on the market that is less than 18% THC. Most of it is in the mid-20s. The concentrates did not exist in the 1990s. And today, the manufacturers have figured out how to extract the THC out of the plant, discard the plant body, and liquid concentrates end up being vaping liquids, and we see that as high as 85%. If you're consuming a solid concentrate, you are dabbing, and those are as high as 95%. So this drug is wicked strong. Those concentrates can very easily be put in foods and drinks, and they are, and it's created this new class of products called edibles. These concentrates can also be put in every other kind of product out there: lotions, salves, tinctures, patches, tampons. It's endless what you will find on the market. Because you have legalized, you have now commercialized this drug, and you are going to see commercial language around it. All kinds of advertising and promotion, branding are a new normal. You see an endless amount of logos and that kind of thing. If we talk real specifically about these forms for a minute, this is plant form. This may all look familiar, but just to point it out, this is a large outdoor grow. This is a large indoor grow. This is an illegal grow in a regional park. This thing in the middle here is 6 plants growing indoors. So I do know that the New Mexico law allows for home grows. It is a ton of marijuana. I don't think New Mexico is requiring licensing for home grows. Most states do not. And I'm not sure why not, but this is a lot of pot, and it kind of creates a gray market that's really accessible to all kinds of people, including your kids. Everyone's fairly familiar with vaping right now, but just to level set, a vape pen has a battery, a coil, a compartment that holds a liquid. When that battery heats up that coil and touches the liquid, it creates an aerosol, and that's what people are breathing in and out. What's in a vape pen? Literally anything that's liquid could be in a vape pen, but typically you see nicotine concentrates or THC concentrates with and or without flavors. How can you tell what's in a vape pen? You cannot. There's no labels once it's in the pen itself. The liquid will come from these vials that are also typically poorly labeled, and nothing necessarily has a smell unless it's been chemically added. How strong is this liquid? Really, a user doesn't know. You saw that vape liquids can be as high as 85%. There are 2 types of vape systems, an open and a closed. The pen system is open, where you unscrew the pen, squirt in the liquid, put it back together, vape, vape, vape. The closed system is pod-based, and Juul, which most people know is our #1 pod brand. Just a couple more pictures of Juul. Each of those pods contains a pack of cigarettes, and Juul, if you are buying a pod from the company, does not have marijuana pods. It also it only sells nicotine pods. Some kids earlier on, not as much today, would Juul and think they were just consuming the flavor, but in fact, all Juul pods have nicotine in them. PAX, for example, is an all THC line or product. And actually PAX and Juul used to be together, and they've been split for a long time. If you look at this, label here, you've got your PAX pod with 85% THC. All the cigarette manufacturers have their own brands. Here are some pictures. This one is always a little disturbing, seemed to be targeted right at kids with Star Wars characters and Batman and pink frills. Tons of flavors in the vaping categories, all kinds. Really is kind of staggering. And just another few minutes on the liquids itself. These are not water vapors. They are actually an aerosol. You've already heard me use the term. An aerosol is a gas that has chemical particles suspended in it, and that you breathe that in. Some of the particles get deposited. You breathe that out. Some of the particles come out. That big vape plume is a secondhand smoke. And we also have something called third-hand smoke with vape aerosols, with those chemical particles falling out of the gas and landing on surfaces. This is a list of chemicals that have been found in our food and cosmetic supply. All of them have been found in vape liquids and aerosols. The ones in red are on the FDA's harmful and potentially harmful substances list. Nothing is good about vaping nicotine or THC. And we saw that with the Valley crisis in 2019, which most people can't even remember. And we also saw it with COVID and how much harder hit people who vaped were by COVID. This is some pictures of dabs. You'll hear it called wax, butter, shatter, hash oil. These are some more pictures. There are vaping devices for dabs, as well as these handheld torches where you will you might have a nail and you drip the wax onto a hot ring or nail or piece of metal of some sort and inhale the gas. Edibles, all kinds of things we could say, but what you'll notice is this packaging is pretty easy to tell that this probably has pot in it. You either have the leaf or funny names, but these cookies, but some states have labels that have to be on all products with THC. And I know Colorado does, California does not. It'd be interesting to see what New Mexico does. But these cookies in the middle are kind of disturbing. I mean, take away this little pot garnish and you would have no way of knowing if there was THC in these cookies or not. That refined or concentrate can be refined down to where it has no smell and no flavor. So you could eat that and not know. The other problem with edibles is that they take longer to feel the effect. So new users actually get into trouble with this a lot because they eat something, they don't feel the effect like you do when you smoke marijuana. You feel that high pretty immediately, but the food or the THC edible has to go in through your digestive system, and it takes a while to get processed and sent to the bloodstream and then up to the brain. So they'll not feel it for 15 minutes, have another bite of something, not feel it for another 15 minutes, have another bite of something. And by that time, they have so much THC in their systems. Lots of people end up in the hospital from that. Other pictures. And then again, just potency. So many of these edibles are extremely, extremely high in THC. Real quick, we've actually had FDA approved THC since the early 80s through the name, it's a name for a chemical called dronabinol. These pills are 10 milligram pills of dronabinol. There's 42 of them. And this chocolate bar has 420 milligrams of THC in it. So these are actually equivalent, the set of pills, the 42 pills, and the chocolate bar in their potency. Astronomical amount of THC. There's also the renowned Korova cookie that has 1,000 milligrams of THC in it. And this label actually says serving sizes per container 100. So that many. We have kind of standardized on 10 milligrams as a serving size. Hemp, we hear a lot about. A hemp plant looks exactly like a marijuana plant. It's all about this definition right here. 3.3% of THC by weight is what makes a marijuana plant a hemp plant. The problem with that is the by weight factor or component. This shows us that a teaspoon and a tablespoon of THC by weight extracted from a hemp plant can amount to a lot of THC. 13 milligrams for a tablespoon, 40 milligrams for a teaspoon, 13, a tablespoon, 40. So it's a lot of the drug. And the other problem we're having with hemp right now is all of that. The chemists are good and can do all kinds of amazing things. And they can extract the psychoactive components out of a hemp plant and concentrate them. And we're ending up with products or different molecular components that are then put into products. So you'll hear Delta 8 now, THCO. Some of these are extremely potent. Okay, take a deep breath and talk about some parenting perspectives. So it's always been our responsibility to help our kids navigate drugs and alcohol. And like I said earlier, there's no neutral position on pot any longer. But the good news in that is there's so many studies in so many spaces that prove that parent influence is the number one influence, peer influence, number two, for kids. So studies that show if you are talking to your children about drugs, they are going to use and try much less. If you're telling them you're not in favor of it, you don't agree, or it's not what your family's doing, is it going to do, they are much less likely to use than their peers who are not hearing that from their parents. So parents are incredibly important. We also know that adult addiction is now considered a childhood onset disease. Okay, 90% of adult addicts started smoking, drinking, or using other drugs before they were 18. 90%. It's an unbelievable statistic. So we have so much ability to influence our children's future selves or lives, and they have so much ability to impact their future selves that we really want to start getting in conversation about this. The other thing to know is addiction is considered hereditary. So a child has about a 50% greater chance of becoming addicted if addiction runs in their family. Another point, marijuana can cause mental illness. In any situation, and you've probably experienced this, if a child starts to use anything heavily, the narrative around that will many times become, well, they were just self-medicating an underlying mental illness. And that in fact, may be true, but it is also equally possible that they have created that mental illness with their use of these drugs at such a young age. We now consider gateway drugs a little differently. Most people have heard marijuana be called a gateway drug, and people like to debate and argue about that, but in fact it is, for very simple reasons. One is you start to behaviorally train yourself. Okay, I'm stressed, I'm socializing, I feel like this, I feel like that, I consume this drug, which is part of the addictive training that we do to ourselves. And also cannabinoids and opioids run on the same set of neural processors, G protein receptors. So if your brain is going to be one of those that wants more after you start smoking pot, the step off to cannabinoid or to opioids is just not that difficult. All that said, however, when we're talking about adolescents, we look at the three majors now as gateway drugs: alcohol, marijuana, and cigarettes. They're all addictive. They're easily accessible. Teen brains are especially vulnerable to them. And statistically, we are seeing if a kid is using one, they're using others. And this is a great chart, and it's a little more daunting than it actually is. But this is 2017 NATSA data. And this is for 12 to 17-year-olds, all boxes. And then in this box, we're talking about marijuana. So if a kid did not smoke marijuana, these are the levels in which they were using the other drugs: drinking, cigarette use, and other illicits. If they were using marijuana, these are the levels in which they were using the other drugs. Significantly different and more. Same for cigarettes. Not using cigarettes, this is how much we use. I'm not doing this right. This is how much we used the other drugs. Using cigarettes, this is the levels in which we use the other drugs. Drink, marijuana, and illicits. Same with alcohol. If the kid was not using alcohol, or kids weren't, they were using the other drugs at these low levels. If they were drinking, they were using the other drugs at these different levels. They track alcohol usage in 3 different levels. This is use, this is binge, this is heavy. So the more they were drinking, the more other drugs they were using. So this really negates that idea that one of these drugs is better for our kids than others. It also negates the idea that if I let my kids use alcohol or smoke marijuana, they won't drink alcohol. We do not see that statistically. So when we're talking to parents and doing kind of a real kind of in-depth parent ed conversation, we will, the first thing we say is that every family and parent really has to find their tone and technique in this discussion. What's going to work for one family isn't going to work for another. What's going to work for one kid sometimes doesn't work for another. Parents actually have to end up putting in a lot of work to figure out how they're going to talk to the kids about it. We'll talk about techniques and communication goals and frames of reference, and I will circle back to that in a minute. I'll point out a few, but right now I want to talk about some responses. Because you're newly legalizing or about to really roll into, it's about to really roll out, you may be hearing all kinds of chatter from your kids. You may be hearing all kinds of chatter from your parenting peer groups. And just here's some common things that we hear. So it's not addictive. Marijuana is not addictive. We've kind of already gone through that. We know it is. No one ever has died from marijuana use. Again, went through that. They have. It's better for me than alcohol. Again, it's not. It's different for you than alcohol, and there's very specific mechanisms and way it works in the brain and body. And it's important to know the difference. The war on drugs has failed. So whenever I hear this, I always want to ask, what exactly do you mean by that? Because it's a buzz phrase that gets used a lot. Most people don't have any real attachment to the phrase or really any understanding of what it means. So I'll always just ask what we're talking about. Most of the time, I'll end up hearing, if someone does have anything to say about it, that something about people are being unnecessarily incarcerated. And what I try to do is just point out that these are 2 different topics. If we want to talk about criminal justice reform, let's talk about that. There's a lot of work to be done. The idea of legalizing a drug, to equate that to criminal justice reform, is something that the industry is using, but doesn't really work. And we've seen it isn't working. Communities of color are not being better taken care of or better supported in legalized states, and most of the time worse. Sam has a lot of great one-pagers on that, that if you're interested in, it's a great way to kind of start your research. And then this last one, or this one on this side, prohibition hasn't worked. I always laugh at that. It has. If you look at, this is a chart, a use chart from more NATSA data. What you're seeing is age group columns here, and here. I think it's 12 to 17, 18 to 25, 26 plus. The states in red, let's see. The states at the top have the most use in the categories. The states at the bottom have the least use in the categories. The states in red have recreational legalization. The states in white don't have any, or basically very little legalization. The states in green have medical legalization. So all the red states, the majority of the red states have the majority of the use, and then all the white states are in the lower half of the chart. So it does. And then moving on, those being kind of more marijuana specific, you'll hear all kinds of rhetoric around legalization itself, like it will protect kids. We have seen no reduction in kid use anywhere in our country, in no state. So we have not found the regulatory elements or framework that protects kids when it comes to legalization. Talk about that more at another time. It will raise valuable taxes. It will raise some taxes. To date, no legal state has met revenue projections with these taxes, and the costs incurred with legalization far exceed the revenue that's brought in. So hospitals, stays, ER visits, domestic violence, traffic fatalities, these things from these public health problems cost the estate a lot of money. And as I've said today, taxes haven't come close to covering any of that. The elimination of the black market. We're going to legalize and get rid of the black market. So that hasn't happened anywhere. The exact opposite is true. All the illegal or illicit markets grow because they all enjoy this veil of legitimacy now. And to date, no legal state has contemplated to the right levels what law enforcement's role is in legalization. And no state has funded to the levels that they need to even begin to enforce their framework, much less get rid of or insist that the illicit market come into it. Right now, California has, there's some arguments about it, but 70 to 80% of its marijuana supply chain is still outside its legal framework. And to me, that's rational. If I was in the marijuana business and had been for decades, I wouldn't sign up for the legal framework. I mean, why would you? It costs a lot of money. It's a lot of bureaucracy. I know how to do this business just fine. Thank you very much. So anyway, eliminating the black market does not go away because you legalize. The only hope for eliminating a black market is law enforcement. It'll free up law enforcement. Again, no funding for law enforcement. This doesn't free up law enforcement. More marijuana problems happen. They don't have the funding. It's just a law enforcement debacle. Reduction in traffic fatalities, as we've said, every state has seen an increase in traffic fatalities. It's a matter of social justice. And this one, especially of teenagers, if they're social justice warriors, like most of them are these days, you will hear this one. The problem with it is that the harms are common. A child of color gets affected neurologically the same way a child, my child would. There's no difference between who gets harmed based on anything racial whatsoever. So I think people, if they're thinking at all about this, tend to be making another war on drugs has failed statement. And again, that issue and that thinking is really criminal justice reform. And there's a lot that can be done in that space. So just to give you some counterpoints as the conversation around marijuana will continue around you. So just quickly, tips for parents, back to that one slide that I just wanted to point out. Lots families, again, and having to find their own technique and their own approach. Many families can have the conversation with their kids. Hey, this is not what we do. It's not okay. These are the consequences. I don't want to see it, to whatever level. And again, whatever matches your personality and your family's personality. But if that abstinence thing is not going to work, delay is what lots of parents are using today, in that I want you to delay till X year, X time in your life, or I want you to delay as long as you can. It's just a concept that's helping in a conversation, and in some families where that very binary black, white, yes, no, do, don't is not really working. And then the one in the middle, the last section, you'll get kids that kind of that will become, weed warriors. This is their generation's drug, the social justice stuff. This is for us. This is not for you. You don't know what you're talking about. This is better for me than anything, on and on and on and on. And one response to that can be, okay, I want you to, I see that you're passionate about it. I want to support what you're passionate about. But in this case, we don't want to be naive about the fact that there is a massive marijuana industry that is feeding you a lot of this messaging. If you have this kind of relationship with your kid, you can start look at the messaging with each other. What do you think that's saying? What do you think that's saying? What are they trying to get you to believe here? And kind of bring that idea of this is not a grassroots movement. This is a heavily top-down, well-funded movement to convince you to use drugs. This industry doesn't care if you get addicted. They don't care if your grades fail. They don't care if you leave your sport. They don't care one thing about you. In fact, if you get addicted, all the better, because you're a lifelong customer at that point in time. So we just like to point some of these things out as options and ways to approach these things with your kids. We do have, the wonderful previous Surgeon General that did definitively say on the record, no amount of marijuana is safe for adolescents or pregnant women because of all this brain development stuff. So you're, as a parent, right in your I don't want you using position, scientifically and in all kinds of ways. So that's it for tonight. If you want to continue the conversation, Parent Movement 2.0 has so many different resources on our website and otherwise. And I think Brenda said in the beginning, we also are doing a podcast with the Talk They Hear You campaign that SAMHSA develops and manages over time, which is another great campaign for parents and to give ideas about how to talk with your kids and what to say and what the facts are. And the podcast is on their website as well. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. That was fantastic. With myself being a parent with 2 teenagers, it was definitely helpful for me. And I will definitely take a lot of these things back to my kids as well. So
great.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. We all appreciate your time. And thank you everybody for joining the SAM New Mexico webinar. For more information on SAM New Mexico and how to join our efforts, you can go to www.samnewmexico.org. As I mentioned in the beginning, we'll be going ahead and having this up on our SAM New Mexico Facebook page, and we'll also try to get it up onto the website as well. I think everybody that joined the webinar has my email. I guess, Debbie, would it be okay for us to send out the PowerPoint to the attendees?
Sure. I'll send you a condensed document.
Great. And we'll get that out to everybody either tomorrow or by the end of this week. So no rush on that, Debbie. But thank you again. It was great to see you. Thanks for everybody for joining. And stay tuned. We'll most likely be having another webinar coming up in the month of March. So thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.